The cabin door hung open like a broken jaw, revealing nothing but shadow and silence. Deputy Elias Pritchard stepped across the threshold, his boots echoing against bare floorboards where a family had lived just 3 days before. The Hensley place stood empty, chairs pushed back from the dinner table, half-eaten biscuits still on plates, coffee gone cold in chipped porcelain cups. But the door. Someone had driven 16 penny nails through the oak planks from the inside, sealing the exit shut. Pritchard counted each one, his fingers tracing the iron heads that had torn through wood with desperate force. Outside, morning fog clung to the hollow like a shroud, muffling the distant sound of Copperhead Creek and the whisper of wind through autumn leaves. This was the 7th house in Blackrock Hollow found this way. 7 families vanished without trace, their homes transformed into sealed tombs of ordinary life interrupted. The locals whispered one name when they thought no one was listening. Thompson, the mountain family that made their own rules. Blackrock Hollow carved itself into the Cumberland Mountains like a secret too dangerous to share. The creek ran cold and clear between walls of limestone that rose 300 feet on either side, creating a natural fortress where sound echoed strangely and shadows lingered long past noon. In 1928, 12 families called this place home, scattered along the creek bed in cabins their grandfathers had built with hand tools and stubbornness. At the mouth of the hollow, where the trail wound down from the county road, a wooden sign hung crooked from a hickory post. Private property, no trespassing, violators prosecuted. The paint had faded to ghost white, but the message remained clear enough. Most folks respected the warning. The hollow had a reputation. Ezra Thompson had put up that sign in 1892, the year after he'd settled his family in the deepest part of Blackrock Hollow. Now his grandson, Jeremiah Thompson, maintained the boundary with the same fierce determination. The Thompsons lived furthest back, where the creek narrowed to a whisper and the mountains pressed close enough to block out half the sky. They keep to themselves, Sheriff Claude Brennan would tell anyone curious enough to ask. Always have. Long as they don't cause trouble in town, I got no call to bother them. But trouble had a way of finding the hollow anyway. The first disappearance happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. The Hensley family, mother, father, 3 children, simply vanished between supper and dawn. Their neighbors, the Crawfords, found the cabin door nailed shut from the inside. The breakfast dishes still laid out on the table. No sign of struggle, no indication where they'd gone. The county sent Deputy Pritchard to investigate. He was young enough to believe in procedures and old enough to recognize when something defied explanation. The sight of those nails driven through solid oak stayed with him for weeks. Maybe they had debts, Pritchard suggested to Sheriff Brennan back in town. Maybe they needed to disappear for a while. Brennan nodded, but his eyes held doubt. The Hensleys didn't owe nobody nothing. Been farming that bottom land for 20 years, paying their taxes, minding their business. Within a month, the Crawford cabin stood empty too. Same circumstances. Door nailed shut from inside. Family gone without a trace. Then the Mercers, the Bowmans, the Kellys. Each time, Deputy Pritchard made the journey into Blackrock Hollow, documenting what he found. Meals interrupted, belongings left behind, lives abandoned in the middle of ordinary moments. Each time, those 16 penny nails sealed the exits from within. The pattern emerged like a dark constellation. Every vanished family had one thing in common. They'd all reported strangers nosing around their property in the weeks before they disappeared. Outsiders asking questions about the hollow, about the families who lived there, about the Thompsons who kept to the back country, strangers with cameras and notebooks claiming to study mountain folk ways, strangers offering cash for family stories and local legends, strangers who walked the creek bed with measuring tools and surveyors' transits. Each family had complained to their neighbors about the intrusions. Each family had grown increasingly nervous as the strangers became more persistent, and each family had consulted with Jeremiah Thompson about what ought to be done. The hollow was protecting itself. Jeremiah Thompson stood 6 feet 4 inches in his bare feet, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown hog and hands that could split kindling or a man's skull with equal ease. His beard grew wild and black, streaked with silver that caught the firelight when he sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the shadows gather between the trees. He'd inherited more than land from his grandfather Ezra. The Thompson name carried weight in these mountains, the kind of weight that settled disputes before they started and made strong men reconsider their words. For 3 generations, the family had served as unofficial law in Blackrock Hollow, mediating conflicts and protecting their neighbors from outside interference. The Thompson cabin sat in a natural amphitheater where the creek curved around a shelf of granite. Ancient chestnuts towered overhead, their trunks thick as wagon wheels and their branches forming a canopy that filtered sunlight into patterns of gold and green. The house itself was built from logs so perfectly fitted they needed no chinking, with a stone chimney that drew smoke straight up into the mountain air. Jeremiah lived there with his wife Rebecca and their 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, ranging in age from 12 to 22. The eldest boy, Caleb, had his father's size and his grandfather's temper. The others, Samuel, Benjamin, and Mary, possessed the Thompson gift for moving through the forest without disturbing so much as a leaf. They were a family that understood silence. "Daddy says the mountain chooses who belongs here," young Benjamin told his cousin one afternoon as they checked rabbit snares along the creek. "Says the hollow knows when outsiders mean harm." The boy spoke with the certainty of inherited wisdom. His family had been teaching him to read the signs, how deer moved when strangers approached, how birds fell silent in the presence of danger, how the very air seemed to thicken when unwelcome visitors entered their territory. These weren't superstitions. They were survival skills passed down through generations of mountain families who'd learned to protect what was theirs. The morning after the Kellys disappeared, Jeremiah walked the creek bed from his cabin to the mouth of the hollow, examining every bent twig and disturbed stone. His tracking skills had been honed by decades of hunting these mountains, and he could read a trail like scripture. What he found confirmed what he already suspected. Fresh tire tracks on the county road, boot prints that didn't belong to any hollow resident, cigarette butts from store-bought tobacco instead of the twist they all grew themselves. Outsiders had been watching, waiting, planning. That evening, Jeremiah gathered his sons on the front porch as Rebecca served them coffee black as mountain loam. The conversation that followed would never be spoken of directly, but its consequences would echo through the hollow for years to come. "The old ways are under threat," he told them, his voice carrying the authority of mountains themselves. "There's folks who want to change what we are, take what we got, turn our home into their curiosity." Mary sat quietly in the corner, mending a torn shirt with needle and thread. At 17, she possessed her father's intelligence and her mother's intuition, making her perhaps the most dangerous Thompson of all. She understood that protection sometimes required terrible choices. "What Grandpa Ezra started, we'll finish," Jeremiah continued. "The hollow keeps its own. Always has. Always will." The night sounds of the mountains seemed to approve. Owls calling from the darkness, creek water murmuring over stones, wind sighing through the chestnuts like the voices of ancestors offering their blessing. The Thompsons had made their decision. October brought the first hard frost to Blackrock Hollow, painting the creek banks with ice that cracked like gunshots in the morning stillness. The vanished families left behind more than empty cabins. They left a void that changed the very nature of the place. Where once 12 families had called the hollow home, now only 5 remained, and those 5 moved through their daily routines with the wariness of deer in hunting season. Deputy Pritchard increased his visits, driving the narrow mountain road twice a week to check on the remaining residents. Each trip took him past the sealed cabins, their nailed doors like accusations in his peripheral vision. The county had asked him to compile a report on the disappearances, but how do you document the inexplicable? 5 families gone without trace, he wrote in his notebook. No evidence of foul play, no indication of voluntary departure, no bodies, no witnesses. Pattern suggests coordinated action, but motive remains unclear. The surviving families offered little help. They spoke in careful sentences that revealed nothing while appearing to cooperate fully. Yes, they'd noticed the strangers asking questions. No, they hadn't seen anything suspicious on the nights their neighbors vanished. Yes, they'd spoken with Jeremiah Thompson about the situation. No, they couldn't recall exactly what was discussed. The mountain code of silence ran deeper than law enforcement authority. Pritchard tried a different approach. He began studying the land records at the county courthouse, tracing ownership patterns back through decades of deeds and surveys. What he discovered added new layers to the mystery. Blackrock Hollow had been surveyed 3 times in the past 5 years by different companies representing different interests. A railroad company scouting potential routes through the mountains, a coal company exploring mineral rights, a timber company assessing the value of old-growth forest. Each survey team had reported difficulties accessing the interior of the hollow. Equipment malfunctions, local hostility, inexplicable accidents that forced early withdrawal. But they'd all gathered enough information to understand what lay hidden in these mountains. November 3rd, 1928. County Assessor Files. Blackrock Hollow contains an estimated 40 million board feet of virgin timber, plus significant coal deposits. Current tax assessment based on agricultural use only. The outside world had discovered what the Thompson family had been protecting for 3 generations. On a cold Thursday morning, Pritchard made his most important discovery yet. Hidden in a manila folder misfiled in the courthouse basement, he found correspondence between Sheriff Brennan and the various survey companies. The letters revealed a pattern of coordination, planned visits, shared information, assurances of local cooperation. Sheriff Brennan had been selling access to Blackrock Hollow. The realization hit Pritchard like a physical blow. The man he'd trusted, the authority he'd served faithfully, had been betraying the very people he'd sworn to protect. The strangers weren't random intruders. They were paying customers with official sanction. That afternoon, Pritchard sat in his patrol car at the mouth of Blackrock Hollow, staring at the weathered "No Trespassing" sign. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant. This wasn't just private property. It was a boundary between 2 incompatible worlds. On one side lay progress, development, the irresistible force of industrial expansion. On the other side lived people who'd chosen to preserve something older, deeper, more essential than profit. What would you do? When the law itself becomes the instrument of invasion, when authority serves greed instead of justice, when the only protection comes from those willing to break the rules they've been forced to live under? What choice remains? The answer lay waiting in the deepest part of the hollow, where the Thompson family had drawn their line in stone and dared the world to cross it. As evening shadows stretched across the creek bed, Pritchard made his decision. He turned his patrol car around and drove back toward town, leaving the hollow to its secrets and its guardians. Some boundaries, he'd finally learned, were meant to be respected. Sheriff Claude Brennan's office occupied the corner of the courthouse building, its windows offering a view of Main Street and the mountains beyond. On his desk lay 3 separate contracts, each worth more money than he'd see in 5 years of law enforcement salary. Railroad rights, mineral leases, timber harvesting agreements, all contingent on clearing title to Blackrock Hollow. Brennan had worn the sheriff's badge for 14 years, long enough to understand that mountain people operated by their own rules. The Thompson family in particular had always been what he called special cases, folks you handled with diplomacy rather than direct confrontation. But times were changing, and change required adaptation. The call had come from Richmond 2 months ago. A consortium of development companies needed someone local, someone with authority, to smooth the way for their interests in the Cumberland Mountains. The pay was generous. The work was simple. All they wanted was access and information. "Just keep an eye on things," the voice on the telephone had explained. "Make sure our people can do their jobs without interference. You know these mountain families better than anyone. We're counting on your guidance." Brennan had started small. When the first survey team arrived, he'd driven them to the mouth of Blackrock Hollow personally, introducing them to the families as government fellows doing some routine mapping work. Most of the residents had been polite, if not welcoming, answering basic questions about property lines and local landmarks. But the Thompsons had been different. Jeremiah had listened to Brennan's explanation in silence, his dark eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. When the speech was finished, he'd spoken just one sentence. "My grandfather's sign says no trespassing. That means no trespassing." The message was clear, but Brennan had chosen to interpret it as negotiable. The second survey team brought cameras and more sophisticated equipment. They stayed longer, asked more detailed questions, and showed particular interest in the timber resources and potential mining sites. Several families complained to Brennan about the intrusion, but he'd assured them it was temporary, just routine government business that would be finished soon. The complaints stopped after the Hensleys disappeared. October 15th, 1928, Sheriff's Daily Log. No developments in Hensley matter. Deputy Pritchard investigating. Advised families remaining in Hollow to report any suspicious activity. Brennan knew he was walking a dangerous line, but the money was too good to refuse. His wife needed surgery they couldn't afford. His daughter wanted to attend college. The sheriff's salary barely covered their basic needs, while these development contracts offered enough to secure his family's future. He told himself the Hollow families would eventually adjust. Mountain people were practical. They'd see the benefits of development, the opportunities for steady work, the chance to join the modern world. The few holdouts would come around when they saw their neighbors prospering. But the disappearances changed everything. After the third family vanished, Brennan realized he'd underestimated Jeremiah Thompson's commitment to protecting the Hollow. The mountain man wasn't just issuing warnings, he was eliminating threats. The method remained a mystery, but the pattern was undeniable. The development companies grew impatient. They'd invested significant money in surveys and planning, and the delays were costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Phone calls from Richmond became more frequent and less friendly. "We need results, Brennan. Whatever's happening in that hollow, you need to stop it. We've got investors asking hard questions." The sheriff found himself caught between forces he couldn't control. The Thompson family had made their position clear. No outsiders would be tolerated in Blackrock Hollow. The development consortium had made their position equally clear. The hollow would be developed with or without local cooperation. Brennan's solution was to increase the pressure. Instead of sending survey teams one at a time, he began coordinating simultaneous visits by multiple groups. Railroad engineers, mining geologists, timber assessors, all arriving within days of each other, all armed with official paperwork authorizing their presence on what they claimed was soon to be public land. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Within 2 weeks, 2 more families had vanished, their cabins sealed with the now familiar signature of 16 penny nails. The remaining families in the hollow stopped answering their doors when official visitors appeared. Even Deputy Pritchard began asking uncomfortable questions about the coordination between survey teams and local law enforcement. Brennan realized he'd started something he couldn't control. The Thompson family had declared war on outside interference, and they possessed advantages no development company could match. Intimate knowledge of the terrain, generational experience with mountain survival, and most importantly, the absolute conviction that they were defending their home. The sheriff's bargain with progress was about to exact a price higher than anyone had anticipated. Agnes Whitlock had lived in Blackrock Hollow for 67 years, long enough to remember when the Thompson family first settled in the back country. Her cabin sat closest to the hollow's entrance, making her the unofficial sentry for the small community. From her kitchen window, she could see every vehicle that turned off the county road, every stranger who walked the trail into their private world. She'd been watching the morning the Crawford family disappeared. Agnes had risen early to tend her chickens, stepping into the pre-dawn darkness that wrapped around her cabin like a familiar shawl. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and morning dew, punctuated by the distant sound of Copperhead Creek running over its rocky bed. As she scattered feed for the hens, movement on the creek trail caught her attention. 3 figures moved through the shadows with the fluid grace of deer, barely disturbing the fallen leaves beneath their feet. Agnes recognized them immediately, Benjamin and Samuel Thompson, with their sister Mary between them. The younger Thompson children walked the hollow like spirits, appearing and disappearing as if the mountains themselves granted them passage. What caught Agnes's attention wasn't their presence. Thompson children often roamed the hollow before dawn, checking snares and hunting small game. It was their destination. They were heading toward the Crawford cabin, and they carried something between them that looked suspiciously like rope and tools. Agnes stood frozen in her chicken yard, feed scattered around her feet, watching the 3 figures disappear into the deeper shadows near the Crawford place. Part of her wanted to call out, to ask what they were doing. But mountain wisdom ran deeper than curiosity, and mountain wisdom said some things were better left unknown. 20 minutes later, she heard the sound of nails being driven into wood, 16 quick strikes that echoed off the hollow walls before silence returned. By the time the sun rose, the Thompson children had vanished back into the mountains, leaving no trace of their passage. Agnes went about her morning routine as if nothing had happened, feeding chickens and gathering eggs with hands that trembled only slightly. When Deputy Pritchard arrived that afternoon to investigate the Crawford disappearance, Agnes answered his questions with careful honesty. Yes, she'd heard strange sounds early that morning. No, she hadn't seen anything suspicious. Yes, the family had been nervous about outsiders asking questions. No, she couldn't imagine where they might have gone. Everything she said was technically true. Mountain people had perfected the art of selective disclosure over generations of dealing with outside authority. But Agnes wasn't the only witness to the Thompson family's nocturnal activities. Old Henrik Johansson, who lived in the cabin furthest upstream, had been losing sleep since the disappearances began. The Norwegian immigrant had built his home in America to escape the violence of the old country. But now violence had found him even in these remote mountains. Henrik had started keeping watch from his bedroom window, recording the comings and goings in a leather journal he'd brought from Bergen 40 years earlier. His entries, written in a mixture of English and Norwegian, documented a pattern of preparation that spoke to careful planning rather than random violence. October 20, Thompson boys visiting all families in Hollow, speaking long time with each, families giving nods, understanding, something being planned. October 27, surveyor men from railroad coming again, have maps, instruments, Thompson watching from ridgeline, family making ready. November 1st, 3 more families gone, cabins sealed like others. Thompson children working through night. Mountain keeping its own. Henrik understood the stakes involved. He'd seen what happened when powerful interests decided they wanted land that others had claimed. In Norway, such conflicts ended with families scattered and communities destroyed. Here in the mountains, the Thompson family had found a different solution, one that preserved the hollow's integrity at a terrible cost. The old Norwegian faced the same choice as his neighbors: remain silent and preserve the peace, or speak truth and face consequences he couldn't predict. Mountain communities survived by protecting their own secrets, but Henrik had lived through too much history to believe silence could last forever. Someone would eventually talk. Someone would demand answers. Someone would bring enough force to overwhelm even the Thompson family's mountain advantages. In his journal, he began drafting a letter to relatives in Minnesota, describing the beauty of Blackrock Hollow and suggesting they might want to visit come spring. If the situation deteriorated further, his family would need somewhere to go. The Hollow was running out of witnesses. Rebecca Thompson possessed the kind of beauty that mountain ballads celebrated. Dark hair that caught light like polished coal, eyes the color of deep forest shadows, and hands that could tend a wound or prepare a meal with equal skill. She'd married into the Thompson name by choice, understanding what that choice demanded. Her own family, the Grants, had warned against the match. "Them Thompsons are trouble," her father had said. "They live by their own laws, and the law don't always take kindly to that." But Rebecca had seen something in Jeremiah that others missed. Not just strength and determination, but a deep love for the land that bordered on the sacred. The Thompson family didn't just live in Blackrock Hollow. They were part of it in ways that went beyond simple ownership. Now, 23 years later, Rebecca found herself protecting those same bonds from forces that threatened to tear them apart forever. The morning after the Crawfords disappeared, she'd walked to their sealed cabin with a basket of preserves and cornbread, as if maintaining normal routines could somehow restore normal life. The sight of those 16 nails driven through the oak door stopped her in the middle of the creek path, basket clutched against her chest like a shield. Rebecca knew what those nails meant. She'd helped Jeremiah install similar barriers on abandoned buildings throughout the hollow, sealing off structures damaged by time or weather to keep animals and unwanted visitors from taking shelter inside. But this was different. This was a family home converted into something else entirely. A message written in iron and wood for anyone smart enough to read it. She understood her husband's strategy because she'd helped develop it. The plan had emerged from long conversations around their kitchen table, discussions that included not just Jeremiah and herself, but their older children and trusted neighbors. When the outside pressure began building, survey teams, development offers, government officials asking too many questions, the Hollow community had to choose between submission and resistance. Traditional resistance wouldn't work. Mountain families couldn't fight railroad companies and coal consortiums through legal channels. They lacked money, political connections, and access to the kind of lawyers who won cases in Richmond courtrooms. But they possessed other advantages: intimate knowledge of their territory, absolute commitment to protecting their home, and most importantly, the ability to make problems simply disappear. The Thompson solution was elegant in its simplicity. Families facing immediate threat would be relocated to safe territories deeper in the mountains, their homes sealed to suggest mysterious circumstances that would discourage further investigation. The appearance of supernatural intervention would protect the Hollow more effectively than any legal barrier. Rebecca had sewn special pockets into her husband's coat and those of their children, hidden compartments that could carry rope, tools, and other necessities for their nocturnal work. She'd prepared supply caches throughout the mountains, stocked with food and blankets for families who might need to disappear quickly. She'd even identified abandoned mine shafts and remote cabins where the relocated families could establish temporary homes until the current crisis passed. Her role in the deception required skills that few people possessed. Rebecca could pack an entire household's essential belongings into bundles that 3 people could carry through mountain trails in complete darkness. She could make a family's departure look like sudden abandonment while ensuring they actually had everything needed to start fresh elsewhere. Most importantly, she could convince frightened neighbors that their sacrifice served a larger purpose. The Tutitu Hollow has protected our people for 3 generations, she explained to Martha Bowman on the night before that family's disappearance. Your grandfather settled here because this place offered safety. Your children deserve that same safety. Sometimes protection requires hard choices. Martha had nodded through her tears, understanding that cooperation meant survival while resistance might mean genuine disappearance. The permanent kind that left bodies instead of mysteries. Rebecca had perfected the art of making hard choices look like supernatural phenomena. She knew exactly how many nails to drive through a door to create the right visual impact. She understood which belongings to leave behind to suggest interrupted daily life, and which to remove without leaving obvious gaps. She could stage a scene that would baffle investigators while providing just enough uncertainty to fuel legends. November 9th, 1928, Rebecca Thompson's diary. 5 families safe in winter camps. Hollow quiet again. Children learning hard lessons about protecting what matters. Mountain keeping its secrets. The strategy was working, but Rebecca understood its limitations. Each successful relocation bought them time, not permanent solution. Eventually, outside pressure would become too intense to deflect through mystery and misdirection. Eventually, the Thompson family would face a reckoning that couldn't be avoided through clever planning and mountain cunning. But until that moment arrived, she would continue weaving threads of deception and protection, binding her community together with invisible bonds stronger than any legal document. The Hollow would endure. The telegram arrived at Sheriff Brennan's office on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered by a nervous clerk who'd driven the mountain roads from the county seat in record time. The message was brief but unmistakable in its implications. Federal investigators arriving Thursday. Stop Bureau of Investigation, taking jurisdiction. Stop, prepare full cooperation. Stop Washington expects results. Brennan read the telegram 3 times before the reality settled into his bones like winter cold. The Bureau of Investigation meant serious federal attention, the kind of scrutiny that could uncover his financial arrangements with the development consortium. More immediately, it meant hard men with federal authority asking questions that local diplomacy couldn't deflect. The development companies had finally lost patience with his handling of the Blackrock Hollow situation. 7 families vanished without trace, survey teams afraid to enter the mountains, millions of dollars in potential revenue locked behind what increasingly looked like organized resistance. Corporate investors didn't accept mysterious disappearances as explanations for failed projects. Someone had made phone calls to Washington, someone with enough influence to mobilize federal resources. On Thursday morning, 2 black Studebakers wound their way up the mountain road toward Blackrock Hollow, carrying 4 men in dark suits who'd introduced themselves to Brennan with badges instead of smiles. Special Agent Vincent Kowalski led the team, a Chicago veteran with tired eyes and the kind of patient manner that suggested extensive experience with uncooperative witnesses. "We understand you've had some unusual circumstances here," Kowalski said, settling into a chair across from Brennan's desk. "Missing families, sealed buildings, local law enforcement unable to develop leads. Our superiors are concerned that federal crimes may be involved." Brennan chose his words carefully. These mountain people keep to themselves, always have. When families decide to move on, they don't necessarily inform local authorities about their plans. 7 families, Kowalski responded, all from the same isolated community, all leaving behind valuable property and personal belongings, all departing without informing neighbors, relatives, or business associates. That suggests coordination rather than coincidence. The federal agent opened a leather portfolio and began arranging photographs on the desk. Aerial views of Blackrock Hollow that showed far more detail than any local survey. The Bureau had been conducting reconnaissance flights, mapping the terrain and documenting structures from heights that mountain residents couldn't detect. "Your Thompson family owns 1,200 acres in the center of this hollow," Kowalski continued. "Property that 3 separate companies want to develop for timber, coal, and transportation. Property that's become significantly more accessible since 7 neighboring families conveniently disappeared." Brennan felt sweat collecting beneath his collar despite the November chill. The federal investigation had connected patterns he'd hoped would remain invisible. The Bureau understood that the disappearances served specific economic interests, and they'd identified the Thompson family as the most likely architects of whatever was happening in the hollow. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Brennan asked. "I'm suggesting that your Thompson family has been eliminating obstacles to land development through methods that violate multiple federal statutes," Kowalski replied. "Interstate transportation of kidnapping victims, conspiracy to defraud property owners, possibly murder, though we haven't found bodies yet." The agent leaned back in his chair, studying Brennan with eyes that missed nothing. "I'm also suggesting that local law enforcement has been either criminally negligent or actively complicit in these crimes. Which category do you fall into, Sheriff?" The moment Brennan had been dreading for months had finally arrived. His careful balancing act between competing interests was collapsing under federal scrutiny that recognized no local customs or mountain diplomacy. He faced a choice between protecting his community and protecting himself. A choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone in Blackrock Hollow. "I need to make some phone calls," Brennan said finally. "I'm sure you do," Kowalski replied. "But those calls will be made from federal custody. You're under arrest, Sheriff Brennan. You have the right to remain silent." The federal net was closing around Blackrock Hollow, and the Thompson family's war against outside interference was about to escalate beyond their ability to control through mystery and misdirection. Real law was coming to the mountains. Mary Thompson stood at the edge of Widow's Point, a limestone outcropping that offered a commanding view of Blackrock Hollow's entrance. Through her father's field glasses, she watched the black government cars navigate the winding road that led to their sanctuary. 4 men in city clothes had arrived with Sheriff Brennan, and their body language spoke of authority that wouldn't be deflected by mountain courtesy. At 17, Mary possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that made her invaluable to her family's operations. She could read tension in a stranger's shoulders, identify lies in the hesitation between words, and predict behavior with accuracy that bordered on supernatural. Her brothers provided muscle and woodcraft, but Mary supplied the intelligence that kept the Thompson family one step ahead of their enemies. Today, her gift told her that their time of operating in shadows was ending. "Federal men," she called down to where her brothers waited in the tree line. Not the kind who'll be satisfied with mysteries and local legends. Benjamin, now 14 and tall for his age, emerged from cover with the fluid grace that marked all Thompson children. "Daddy said this might happen. Said we'd know when the real fight started." Mary nodded, still studying the distant figures through the field glasses. The federal agents moved with purpose that suggested extensive preparation. They weren't tourists or curiosity seekers. They were professionals conducting an operation that had been planned in distant offices by people who'd never seen these mountains. Samuel, the middle brother at 16, appeared beside them with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Caleb's already moving the families to winter camps. Mama's preparing supply runs. Daddy wants us to implement the final protocol. The final protocol. Mary felt her stomach tighten at the words. For 3 generations, the Thompson family had protected Blackrock Hollow through careful management of outside threats. But they'd always maintained a careful distinction between deterrence and elimination, between removing problems and removing people. The final protocol crossed that line. "How many federal men?" Samuel asked. 4 in the cars. Probably more coming once these report back to Washington. Mary lowered the field glasses and turned to face her brothers. "This isn't about scaring off survey teams anymore. This is about survival." The children understood the stakes because they'd been raised to understand them. Their education included not just reading and arithmetic, but lessons in family history that traced back to the original Ezra Thompson's arrival in these mountains. They knew why their grandfather had chosen this particular hollow, why he'd established such strict boundaries against outsiders, and why each generation had fought to maintain those boundaries regardless of changing times and external pressure. They also knew the cost of failure. Mountain families who couldn't protect their land didn't just lose property. They lost identity, community, and connection to place that defined their very existence. The Thompson children had seen what happened to mountain people forced into towns and cities, watching proud families dissolve into poverty and despair when separated from the land that gave their lives meaning. Mary opened the canvas bag Samuel carried and examined its contents. Rope, tools, materials for constructing barriers and creating diversions. Everything they'd need to implement tactics that had been planned, but never used. The most extreme measures their family could take to preserve their sanctuary. "We're going to hurt people," Benjamin said quietly. It wasn't a question. "We're going to protect people," Mary corrected. Sometimes that requires the same actions with different intentions. The distinction mattered to her because it had to matter. The Thompson family drew their strength from moral certainty, the absolute conviction that they were defending something sacred against forces that would destroy it for profit. That conviction had sustained them through increasingly desperate measures, but it required maintaining clear lines between protection and predation. Mary had spent sleepless nights considering where those lines should be drawn. When does defense become aggression? When does protecting your family require harming someone else's family? When does preserving your way of life justify ending someone else's way of life? The questions had no easy answers, but they had practical consequences. In the next few hours, the Thompson children would discover how far they were willing to go to preserve their hollow's independence. November 22, 1928, Mary Thompson's journal. Federal men in Hollow today. Daddy says we've reached the end of gentle solutions. Brothers ready for hard work. Mountain will decide who stays and who goes. As evening shadows began gathering in the valley below, Mary led her brothers down from Widow's Point toward the federal agents who represented everything their family had spent generations resisting. The final protocol would be implemented tonight, and tomorrow would reveal whether the Thompson family's war against the outside world had been worth its ultimate cost. The children carried their burden with the grim determination of mountain people who'd run out of choices. Special Agent Kowalski felt the mountains watching him as his team made camp beside Copperhead Creek. The federal agents had requisitioned equipment from the county sheriff's office: canvas tents, lanterns, and portable field desks that transformed a creekside clearing into a temporary command post. Their plan was methodical: establish secure base camp, conduct systematic interviews with remaining Hollow residents, then move on the Thompson family with sufficient force to prevent resistance. The plan assumed they were dealing with ordinary criminals using ordinary methods. By sunset, Kowalski realized his assumptions might be fatally flawed. The Hollow possessed an atmosphere that defied rational explanation. Sound behaved strangely between the limestone walls. Voices carried impossibly far, while footsteps seemed muffled by invisible barriers. Shadows gathered in places that should have received direct sunlight, creating pools of darkness that persisted despite the cloudless autumn sky. More troubling was the complete absence of wildlife. No birds called from the trees. No insects hummed in the evening air. Even the creek ran with unusual silence, as if the water itself moved with reluctance through this particular valley. "Agent Morrison," Kowalski called to his youngest team member, "take a walk downstream. See if you can locate any of these sealed cabins the sheriff mentioned." Morrison nodded and disappeared into the gathering dusk, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him as he followed the creek path. 20 minutes later, the beam stopped moving. 30 minutes passed without radio contact. An hour elapsed before Kowalski sent Agent Campbell to investigate. Campbell found Morrison standing motionless beside the Hensley cabin, staring at the nailed door with expressions that suggested profound confusion. "Morrison, report your status." The younger agent turned slowly, as if waking from deep sleep. "Sir, I can't. There's something wrong with this place. I was examining the door, and then..." He paused, struggling with memory that seemed to slip away, even as he tried to grasp it. "I lost time, sir. Substantial time." Campbell examined his partner with growing concern. Morrison's pupils were dilated despite the darkness. His skin was pale and clammy. Most importantly, his service revolver was missing from its holster. "Where's your weapon, Agent Morrison?" Morrison looked down at his empty holster with genuine surprise. "I don't remember removing it, sir." Campbell conducted a quick search of the area around the cabin, but the missing revolver was nowhere to be found. More disturbing was what he discovered near the tree line. Dozens of carved symbols cut into oak and hickory trunks, forming patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The federal agents were operating in territory that followed rules they didn't understand. Back at camp, Kowalski listened to Campbell's report with mounting unease. One agent compromised, one weapon, missing, and signs of organized preparation that suggested the Thompson family had been anticipating federal intervention for weeks or months. "Sir," Agent Williams reported from the radio tent, "we're having communications difficulties. Can't raise the county dispatch or the regional field office. Equipment appears functional, but we're getting nothing but static on all frequencies." Kowalski checked his pocket watch. 8:45 p.m. They'd been in the hollow for 6 hours, and their situation was deteriorating faster than he'd thought possible. Professional instinct warned him to withdraw immediately, regroup with reinforcements, and return with overwhelming force. But federal agents didn't retreat from mountain criminals, regardless of local superstitions or unexplained circumstances. "We'll maintain position through the night," Kowalski decided. "Rotating watches, weapons ready. Tomorrow we make contact with the Thompson family and settle this situation permanently." As the agents settled into their defensive positions, none of them noticed the figures moving through the darkness beyond their camp's perimeter. Mountain children raised on these trails could navigate by starlight alone, approaching within whispering distance without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf. Mary Thompson lay prone behind a fallen log just 20 yards from the federal camp, close enough to hear every word of the agent's planning session. Her brothers had taken positions surrounding the campsite, creating an invisible perimeter that would allow them to monitor and influence everything the federal men attempted. The trap was springing shut exactly as the Thompson family had designed it. "Agent Morrison," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible above the creek's murmur. "Come to the tree line. Come alone." Morrison stood abruptly, his movements mechanical and purposeful. Campbell grabbed his arm, but the younger agent pulled free with surprising strength and walked toward the darkness where Mary waited. "Morrison, stop! That's an order!" But Morrison continued walking, drawn by a voice that promised answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. Morrison found himself standing in a natural amphitheater, where ancient chestnuts formed living columns around a clearing, lit by carefully positioned lanterns. The Thompson family waited for him there, father, mother, and 4 children, arranged like figures in a daguerreotype that captured something essential about mountain life. Jeremiah Thompson rose from his position beside a granite boulder, his impressive frame casting shadows that seemed to encompass the entire clearing. "Agent Morrison, you've been asking questions about my family." Morrison struggled to remember how he'd arrived in this place. His last clear memory was examining the sealed cabin door, but that felt like hours ago. Between then and now stretched a gap filled with fragmentary images, carved symbols, whispered voices, paths through darkness that led to impossible destinations. "You're under federal investigation," Morrison managed to say. "You and your family are suspects in multiple disappearances." "Disappearances," Jeremiah repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting word choice. Suggests people who were here and now aren't here. But what if they were never supposed to be here in the first place?" Rebecca Thompson stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting lantern light like polished stones. "Agent Morrison, how much do you know about the history of Blackrock Hollow?" Morrison tried to access his briefing materials, but his thoughts felt sluggish and disconnected. The federal investigation had focused on current crimes rather than historical context. Washington cared about missing persons reports and property law violations, not local folklore. This hollow has been protected for 3 generations, Rebecca continued. My husband's grandfather settled here to escape exactly what you represent, outside authority that serves outside interests rather than the people who actually live on the land. Caleb Thompson, the eldest son, moved to Morrison's left with the fluid grace that marked all the family members. At 22, he possessed his father's size and his mother's intelligence, making him perhaps the most dangerous of the Thompson children. Federal agents, Caleb said. Railroad companies, coal developers, timber speculators, all singing the same song: progress, modernization, economic opportunity. But the lyrics always end the same way. Mountain families lose their homes. Morrison found his voice returning as adrenaline began cutting through whatever influence had brought him to this clearing. You can't simply eliminate people because you disagree with their business interests. Eliminate? Mary Thompson laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. Agent Morrison, exactly how many bodies have you found in Blackrock Hollow? The question struck Morrison like a physical blow. He'd read every report, examined every crime scene, interviewed every witness. 7 families had vanished without trace, but federal investigators had found no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, and most importantly, no bodies. The families who left this hollow, Jeremiah said quietly, left because they chose to leave. We helped them understand that choice was necessary. Coercion, Morrison replied. Threats of violence. Protection, Rebecca corrected. We offered protection from forces that would have destroyed them eventually anyway. Corporate development doesn't preserve mountain communities. It consumes them. Samuel Thompson stepped out of the shadows carrying Morrison's service revolver, which he offered to the federal agent grip first. You dropped this near the Hensley cabin. Mountain paths can be treacherous in the dark. Morrison accepted the weapon with hands that trembled slightly. The Thompson family had disarmed him without violence, brought him to this isolated location without resistance, and now returned his weapon without apparent concern for their own safety. Their confidence suggested resources and capabilities that federal briefings had failed to identify. What do you want? Morrison asked. Simple, Jeremiah replied. We want to be left alone. We want outside interests to find other mountains to develop, other communities to modernize, other families to displace in the name of progress. And if federal authority won't respect those boundaries? The Thompson family exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Mary nodded slightly to her father, who took a deep breath before answering. Then federal authority will learn the same lesson that railroad surveyors and coal company representatives have already learned, Jeremiah said. The mountain protects its own. Morrison felt the weight of his revolver in its holster, but he also felt the presence of 4 children who could navigate these mountains blindfolded, and a father who'd spent his entire life preparing for exactly this confrontation. Federal training had taught him tactics for urban environments and criminal enterprises. But nothing had prepared him for mountain families who drew their strength from terrain and tradition that stretched back generations. My partners will come looking for me, Morrison said. Your partners are already looking, Benjamin Thompson replied from somewhere in the darkness beyond the lantern light. They've been walking in circles for the past hour, following paths that lead back to where they started. Morrison realized that the federal investigation had walked into a trap that had been decades in the making. The Thompson family hadn't just protected Blackrock Hollow from individual threats. They'd created a comprehensive defense that could neutralize even organized government intervention. The question remaining was whether that defense would stop at disorientation and humiliation, or extend to more permanent solutions. Agent Campbell discovered his team's predicament when he attempted to radio their position to the regional field office. The portable radio produced only static, despite perfect atmospheric conditions and fully charged batteries. More disturbing was his growing realization that the federal agents had been walking the same creekside trail for over an hour without reaching either their base camp or the hollow's entrance. "Sir," Agent Williams reported, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "I've marked 3 separate trees along this path, but we keep encountering the same markers. We're moving in a circle." Kowalski examined the carved symbols Williams had scratched into bark to track their movement. The federal agents had indeed been following a trail that curved back on itself, creating a loop that kept them within a confined area of the hollow, while giving the illusion of progress toward their objective. Mountain cunning was proving superior to federal methodology. "Agent Morrison's been missing for 2 hours," Campbell reminded his supervisor. "We need to consider the possibility that he's been taken hostage." Kowalski nodded grimly. Their carefully planned operation was disintegrating into exactly the kind of disaster that ended careers and prompted congressional investigations. 4 experienced federal agents were being outmaneuvered by what the case files described as mountain primitives with limited education. The classification had been spectacularly wrong. A voice called to them from the darkness ahead. Morrison's voice, calm and apparently unharmed. "Agent Kowalski, I'm here. I've made contact with the Thompson family." The 3 agents hurried toward the sound, following their partner's voice through a gap between towering chestnuts that opened into a natural clearing. Morrison waited there beside a small fire, looking relaxed and uninjured. Behind him stood the Thompson family in their full, intimidating array. "Agent Morrison," Kowalski called out with relief. "Report your status." "Unharmed, sir. The Thompson family has been extremely cooperative. They've agreed to discuss the situation that's brought us to their home." Kowalski studied the scene with growing unease. Morrison's demeanor seemed off, too relaxed for an agent who'd been missing for hours, too familiar with people who were supposed to be hostile suspects. Most troubling was his partner's body language, which suggested comfort rather than alertness. "Agent Morrison, step away from those people and return to formation." Morrison remained beside the fire. "Sir, I think you need to hear what Mr. Thompson has to say about the missing families. The situation isn't what we believed it to be." Jeremiah Thompson stepped forward, his impressive frame seeming to fill the clearing despite its considerable size. "Agent Kowalski, your man has been learning about mountain justice, how communities protect themselves when official law fails to serve their interests. Are you confessing to the crimes you're suspected of committing?" "I'm explaining the difference between crimes and necessities," Jeremiah replied. "Your government recognizes property rights, contract law, corporate development interests, but it doesn't recognize the rights of communities to exist without outside interference." Rebecca Thompson emerged from the shadows carrying a cloth bundle that she placed carefully beside the fire. "Agent Kowalski, how familiar are you with the legal doctrine of eminent domain?" The question caught Kowalski off guard. Federal briefings had portrayed the Thompson family as uneducated mountain dwellers, but Rebecca spoke with the precision of someone who'd studied legal concepts in considerable detail. "Eminent domain allows government to take private property for public use," Kowalski replied cautiously. "With just compensation," Rebecca continued. "But what constitutes just compensation for a way of life? What's the fair, market value of a community that's existed for 3 generations? How do you compensate a family for losing their connection to place. She opened the cloth bundle to reveal a collection of documents, deeds, surveys, correspondence, and legal papers that documented the systematic pressure being applied to Blackrock Hollow by development interests working in coordination with local and state officials. Your investigation focuses on missing families, Rebecca explained. But you haven't investigated the forces that made those families targets for elimination. You're treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. Agent Williams stepped closer to examine the documents, his flashlight revealing corporate letterheads and government seals. These appear to be legitimate legal papers, survey agreements, development contracts, condemnation proceedings, all arranged without consulting the families who actually live here, Jeremiah added. All designed to transfer our land to outside interests who see these mountains as resources to be exploited rather than communities to be preserved. Kowalski felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that the federal investigation had been based on incomplete information. The Thompson family weren't simply mountain criminals. They were community leaders responding to coordinated threats that had been sanctioned by the same government, now investigating them for protecting themselves. The families who disappeared, Mary Thompson said softly. They're safe in new homes, where they can't be forced to sell land they don't want to sell. We helped them escape a situation that would have destroyed them eventually anyway. Forced relocation is a federal crime, Kowalski replied, but his voice lacked conviction. So is conspiracy to defraud property owners, Caleb Thompson responded. So is official corruption that serves corporate interests instead of community welfare. So is using government authority to eliminate obstacles to private development. The federal agents found themselves confronting a moral complexity that their training hadn't prepared them to handle. The Thompson family had indeed removed people from their homes, but they'd done so to protect those people from legal and economic forces that would have achieved the same result through officially sanctioned methods. Mountain justice operated by different rules, but those rules served the same fundamental purpose as federal law, protecting people from those who would harm them. The confrontation reached its turning point when Agent Kowalski demanded to interview the missing families personally. If these people relocated voluntarily, he said, then we need to hear that directly from them. Federal law requires verification that they're alive, safe, and acting of their own free will. Jeremiah Thompson nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this demand. That can be arranged, but the journey to their winter camps requires mountain travel that federal agents might find challenging. We're prepared for whatever difficulties these mountains might present. Mary Thompson smiled at her father's request for permission to speak. At 17, she possessed an authority within the family that transcended normal age hierarchies, the kind of respect earned through demonstrated wisdom rather than inherited position. Agent Kowalski, she said, before we take you to see the relocated families, you need to understand what you'll be walking into. These people didn't just leave their homes. They left their old lives entirely. They've chosen to disappear from a world that wanted to destroy their community. Chosen or been coerced? Chosen, Benjamin Thompson interjected. But choice made under pressure, like choosing between losing your land to development companies or losing your land to winter starvation. Either way, you lose your land. Rebecca opened another bundle and spread its contents on the ground beside the fire. Photographs, letters, and newspaper clippings that documented the fate of other mountain communities that had succumbed to outside development pressure. Cumberland Gap, she said, pointing to photographs of abandoned cabins and clear-cut forests. Bethesda Hollow, Pine Ridge Valley, all beautiful mountain communities. all destroyed by the same combination of corporate interests and government cooperation that's targeting Blackrock Hollow now. The images spoke volumes about the consequences of failing to resist development pressure. Where thriving communities had once existed, only industrial scars remained. Families scattered to urban slums. Cultural traditions lost forever. Mountain heritage reduced to tourist attractions managed by the same companies that had eliminated the authentic communities. The families we helped relocate, Jeremiah explained, they saw those photographs. They understood what would happen if they stayed and fought through legal channels. They chose preservation over profit. Agent Williams studied the documentation with growing concern. These development patterns appear coordinated. Multiple companies targeting specific regions, using similar tactics, receiving similar government cooperation. Because they are coordinated, Caleb Thompson replied. Corporate development isn't random, it's systematic. They identify valuable resources, neutralize local opposition, then extract maximum profit with minimum consideration for community impact. Kowalski felt the federal investigation spinning beyond his control as he realized that the Thompson family possessed evidence of corruption that extended far beyond their remote mountain hollow. The missing families weren't victims of local crime. They were refugees from a systematic assault on mountain communities that enjoyed official sanction. Where are these families now? He demanded. Safe, Mary Thompson replied. Building new lives in places where corporate development hasn't discovered them yet. Places where they can preserve their way of life without constant threat of displacement. I need locations, addresses, verification that they're alive and well. Jeremiah exchanged glances with his wife and children, and Kowalski recognized the moment when accommodation ended and resistance began. The Thompson family had been willing to explain their actions, even justify them, but they wouldn't compromise the safety of the families they'd protected. That's not possible, Jeremiah said quietly. Then you're under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and violation of federal statutes governing interstate transportation of persons. No, Rebecca Thompson said with absolute finality. We're not. The word hung in the air like smoke from the campfire, carrying implications that transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The Thompson family wasn't submitting to federal authority because federal authority had proven itself unworthy of their submission. They were declaring independence. Samuel Thompson stepped out of the shadows carrying equipment that federal agents recognized immediately. Their radios, weapons, and identification papers, all removed while their attention had been focused on the family's explanations. Your government sent you here to eliminate obstacles to corporate development, Jeremiah continued. But some obstacles can't be eliminated. Some communities can't be destroyed. Some families draw lines that no one can cross. Kowalski reached for his sidearm and found an empty holster. His team's weapons had been removed with the same mountain cunning that had disoriented their movement through the hollow. They'd been outmaneuvered by people they'd consistently underestimated. You can't hold federal agents indefinitely, Kowalski warned. When we don't report back, more agents will come. Eventually, you'll face force that mountain cunning can't deflect. Maybe, Mary Thompson acknowledged. But maybe the mountain has more secrets than your government suspects. Maybe Blackrock Hollow can protect itself in ways that corporate lawyers and federal investigators can't overcome. As if responding to her words, the campfire flared brighter, casting dancing shadows that made the Thompson family seem larger, more formidable, almost supernatural in their presence. The federal agents found themselves confronting not just local criminals, but representatives of something older and more fundamental than government authority. The mountains were choosing sides. Dawn broke over Blackrock Hollow, with the cold clarity that only November mountains could provide, revealing a landscape transformed by overnight snow that had fallen silently while federal agents spent the night in Thompson family custody. The white covering erased familiar landmarks and created a world that seemed disconnected from ordinary geography. Agent Kowalski woke to find himself lying beneath wool blankets beside the embers of the previous night's fire. His team arranged around him in similar states of disorientation. Their weapons, radios, and equipment remained missing, but they were unharmed and sheltered from weather that could have killed them during an unprotected night outdoors. The Thompson family was nowhere to be seen. "Sir," Agent Morrison reported as consciousness returned to the federal team, "we've been drugged. Something in the coffee or food they offered us last night." Kowalski tested his coordination and found his reflexes sluggish but functional. Mountain people had perfected the art of controlling adversaries through herbal preparations that produced compliance without permanent harm. Knowledge passed down through generations of families who'd needed to neutralize threats without leaving evidence of violence. "Status report," Kowalski ordered. Williams checked their equipment and confirmed that everything useful had been removed during the night. "Radio equipment disabled but not destroyed. Weapons missing. Transportation keys gone. But we have food, blankets, and basic survival supplies." The federal agents found themselves in the position of dependent guests rather than investigating officers. The Thompson family had neutralized their authority while ensuring their survival, a combination of mountain hospitality and strategic brilliance that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. A folded paper lay beside the cold ashes of their fire, weighted down with a smooth creekstone. Agent Campbell retrieved it and read aloud. "Agent Kowalski and team, you asked to interview the families who left Blackrock Hollow. Follow Copperhead Creek upstream for 2 miles until you reach the old logging camp. The trail markers will guide you from there. Come alone and come unarmed. The mountain will decide whether you're ready for what you'll find. J. Thompson." "It's obviously a trap," Morrison said. "Everything in this hollow has been a trap from the moment we arrived," Kowalski replied. "But we're federal agents with a job to complete. If the Thompson family wants to show us evidence that supports their claims, we'll examine that evidence." Williams studied the snowy landscape with growing concern. "Sir, we're not equipped for mountain travel in winter conditions. Our vehicles are disabled, our communications are down, and we don't know this terrain." "Then we'll learn it," Kowalski decided. "The Bureau doesn't retreat from mountain criminals, regardless of weather conditions or tactical disadvantages." The federal agents began their journey upstream, following creek water that had been transformed by overnight freeze into patterns of ice that created natural stepping stones and bridges. The snow had obliterated most visual landmarks, but the creek itself provided reliable navigation through terrain that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. 2 miles upstream, they found the ruins of an old logging camp, weathered cabins, rusted equipment, and a network of roads that had once carried timber out of these mountains to feed industrial development in distant cities. The logging company had departed decades earlier, leaving behind environmental damage that would require generations to heal. More importantly, they found the missing families. The Hensleys, Crawfords, Mercers, Bowmans, Kellys, and 2 other families whose disappearances had triggered the federal investigation were living in restored logging cabins, creating a community that looked remarkably similar to what they'd left behind in Blackrock Hollow. Children played in the snow while adults tended to daily tasks that suggested permanent rather than temporary settlement. "Agent Kowalski," Harold Hensley called out as the federal agents entered the camp. "We wondered when you'd find us. Jeremiah said you'd been asking questions. The reunion was surreal. Families reported missing were clearly alive, healthy, and living in circumstances that suggested voluntary relocation rather than forcible abduction. They welcomed the federal agents with coffee and warm food, answering questions with relaxed honesty that contradicted every assumption the investigation had been based on. "We chose to leave," Martha Crawford explained. "Development companies were making our lives impossible. Constant pressure to sell our land, legal threats, harassment of our children. The Thompson family offered us an alternative." "No one forced you to relocate?" "Jeremiah convinced us," Edwin Mercier replied. "Showed us what happened to other mountain communities that tried to fight corporate development through legal channels. Made it clear that preservation required sacrifice." Agent Morrison studied the camp with professional attention to detail. "This settlement represents significant planning and resource investment. How long have you been preparing for mass relocation?" 3 years, Rebecca Thompson answered, emerging from one of the restored cabins with an infant in her arms. "Ever since the first survey team started mapping our hollow, we knew this day would come." Kowalski felt pieces of a complex puzzle clicking into place as he understood the scope of the Thompson family's operation. They hadn't simply responded to immediate threats. They'd developed a comprehensive strategy for community preservation that anticipated and countered corporate development pressure. "The sealed cabins," Williams realized. "They're not crime scenes. They're theatrical props designed to suggest supernatural intervention." "Exactly," Mary Thompson confirmed, joining her mother in the center of the camp. "Corporate developers are superstitious about unexplained disappearances. They'll accept mysterious circumstances more readily than organized resistance." The federal investigation had uncovered not a criminal conspiracy, but a sophisticated community defense that preserved mountain families while creating the appearance of supernatural intervention. The Thompson strategy protected vulnerable neighbors while maintaining plausible deniability that prevented corporate retaliation. It was brilliant, illegal, and completely effective.